Some of the urgent questions that emergency COBRA meeting is considering is the role of online influencers, the role of big tech companies, and perhaps even the role of rogue states in directing this disorder. But most urgently of all, why can't the police seem to stop it from spreading? Tomorrow, it's worrying, the police say, that the far-right groups have been posting about descending on cities across England. They have been warning counter-protesters not to come out to confront them, even if they think that they'll be doing good by, for example, defending hotels. In Plymouth last night, when anti-racist groups came out to confront them, there were violent clashes. We witnessed the same here in Birmingham, when a group of predominantly Muslim men came out initially to defend their mosques, they said, but it quickly descended into violence. And the police have said, do not come out tomorrow, stay in your own communities. We've already seen hundreds of arrests, we've seen prosecutions and the first convictions. And in England and Wales, the Director of Public Prosecution said the situation on our streets is now a national emergency.
Attention, attention, this is a police message.
Belfast, Plymouth, Darlington. The streets ablaze, another night of rampaging and rioting, the police seemingly unable to stop its spread. In Northern Ireland, a man in his 50s was badly beaten, his head stamped on, in a racially motivated attack. The police service believe there's a paramilitary element involved in this violence. In England, the security services are investigating who else is directing this disorder, as it continues to impact people's homes, businesses and families.
I just woke up in the morning and my mum told me that we're to pack our bags. I was just really scared, just shaking all day.
This schoolgirl and her little sisters had minutes to leave their home and go and stay in a safe house because their dad's business was listed as a target on a far-right chat group.
You must be missing all your things, your bedroom and all your toys and...
I don't message my friends or anything about it because I don't want any more trouble or anything.
And how do you feel about the people who have made you leave your house?
It's like racism, like I don't like it. I don't understand why someone would want to be racist.
So when you saw your name there on that list, I mean, how did you feel? It must have been so frightening.
It is frightening because you just panicked. You just think that something worse is going to happen.
Her dad is an immigration solicitor. His home address was posted online in a list containing the details of dozens of law centres marked as potential targets. One post was viewed 125,000 times in 2 hours.
Yeah, of course, yeah. When we talked about home and you're living there with your children and 3 daughters who are little ones, you just feel scared. I said to my wife and children, I said, get everything in the bag and we just got to go. Get the passports.
You actually thought that you might have to leave the country?
It was unfortunate that it was a feeling of leaving the country than rather leaving the city at that moment. Sorry.
Mr. Mukhtar's address was included in a list circulated by far-right groups on the messaging app Telegram. It called for no more immigration and advised those targeting the businesses to mask up. One of those Telegram channels also shared a manual on how to commit arson. Those who researched the far-right say it originated from Russian neo-Nazi groups. Senior Home Office officials are aware of this document and have been in contact with the relevant police forces. Today saw the first conviction of a man aged 28 for posting criminal messages linked to the violence. The Director of Public Prosecution says some rioters could be charged with terrorism offences in what he describes is now a national emergency. Counter-protesters have been warned not to come out onto the streets. This is what we witnessed when that happened in Birmingham last night. It started when hundreds of predominantly Muslim men came out, they said, to protect their mosques after far-right groups were supposedly on their way to the city. But then a rumour that the EDL were inside this pub. Some of the men came to attack it. Denise, who'd been inside, told me how scared she was.
We were inside, having a drink, having a laugh with friends, and then before we knew it, everyone was around us.
And did you think they were going to come in and attack you?
They would have done if we'd have allowed it. Very scary. I have never been in a situation where a puppy's been attacked for no reason.
One man was beaten up. Windows were smashed. When Naveed and his friends who live locally heard what happened, they came to calm tensions and to apologise to everyone in the pub.
We'd like to apologise, for people's behaviour.
I'll be honest, the thugs, this was not in the name of Islam, the old thugs. Islam doesn't teach us this.
If you don't know how to behave, stay at home. It's as simple as that.
A night that showed just how quickly misinformation can stoke terrifying violence, but which this time at least ended with a handshake and hope.
Love ya. Love you, mate.
Darshna Soni reporting. Well, I'm joined now by Nick Emerson, President of the Law Society of England and Wales, some of whose members are now under threat from the far right. Thank you very much for coming to the studio. How many members?
Well, there have been widely circulated posts on social media targeting 39 immigration law firms and agencies for attack and violence.
Specifically?
Yes. It's listing them. They're from across the country, and it's a specific list. We've heard reports of that going up to 45 or even 60, but the ones we've seen are 39.
Has this happened before?
No. This is unprecedented. We appreciate that our members work in delivering a frontline service in an area of law that is subject to quite angry debate. And we also appreciate that our members are literally on the front line of the high street, their doors open onto the pavement. And so we take this very seriously and know it's not happened before.
And there seems to be a systematic, concerted campaign. Did you see this coming at all?
We've had a lot of attacks on lawyers and immigration lawyers in the past few years, most notably by members of the government and even former prime ministers.
And on some newspapers as well, let's face it.
Yes, and judges have been attacked as well. So there has been a growing atmosphere of intimidation towards judges and lawyers, but not into this actual physical violence.
And do you think that those headlines that we saw a few years ago against the judges, enemies of the people and so on, did that start the rot where people are taking on lawyers themselves and the rule of law?
Absolutely. And it wasn't just that. There's been, even last year, even this year, there's been some MPs who've said things. And so, yes, it all contributes. And we've said that really does undermine the rule of law and what the role of lawyers is.
And you want greater protection for those lawyers?
Yes.
Are you going to get that? And what does that look like?
Well, I've written to the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Lord Chancellor, and asking them to take this very seriously. And the indications we've had from government is that they're going to. But we've also been on the ground.
What does that mean? Sorry to interrupt. Does that mean, cops, in the offices or,
Well, this is what we've been
protection, personal protection, security? Or?
Yeah, well, in terms of what we've been dealing with each of the members, we've contacted them one by one and said, please boost up your security. Please consider not coming into the office and working from home. And so all these sorts of measures you'd expect to provide security for people first, but obviously the property and their infrastructure second.
So we know from the pandemic era that the whole criminal justice system has got bogged down. There are massive delays. When the Prime Minister calls for swift justice at the moment, is he being unrealistic?
Well, swift and efficient was the wording, I think, that was used by one minister, if not the Prime Minister. And I think when there are Crown Court backlogs of 68,000, backlogs in the magistrate courts of 387,000 cases, then unless we treat this as a special emergency situation, then yes, he is being realistic, because every day that's not what we're seeing. Justice should be swift, absolutely, but it's not.
But will it be, do you think? Could it be?
I think exceptions will be made for this case, and they're going to ask lawyers to stand up and work extra hours to do this. But this, we're really with a criminal justice system that has been depleted of funds. It's not been a protected department. You're really living on the fumes of goodwill of the legal profession.
Because as the head of the Crown Prosecution Service during the last riots in 2011, Keir Starmer was the one, who made that swift justice happen.
Yeah, but obviously, even if people attack lawyers, they're still entitled to a lawyer to defend them as well, which is the irony of this situation. And so it's asking those lawyers to come and step forward, those legal aid lawyers to step forward as well, which is different from the CPS who are prosecuting. And
finally, we've heard again from the head of the Crown Prosecution Service today that some of these crimes should be classed as terrorist crimes. Do you think that's a good idea?
If it's lawful, then yes, it's a good idea, but it does seem to be quite interesting language to use. And
is it too much?
It could be. I'd have to take a view on that. But yes, but I trust the DPP. He's a good man, and I think if he sees it as terrorism and he sees the facts of the cases, then absolutely I support him in that.
Nick Emerson, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
There we go. Aisha, over to you in Leeds.
Thanks, Matt. Now, Elon Musk has stepped up his attacks on Sir Keir Starmer with a series of posts questioning the Prime Minister's handling of the riots. Taking to X, the social media platform he owns, Musk reposted footage of disturbances to his 193 million followers, asking why, in his words, all communities aren't protected, and tagging the PM. It comes after an earlier post in which he claimed civil war was inevitable. He also used the hashtag two-tier Keir, which has been adopted by some on the far right to imply double standards in how different communities are treated by law enforcement. Well, to discuss this war of words, I'm joined now by Mark Owen-Jones, who's a professor of media analytics and a disinformation expert. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. You know, 10 months ago, we had Elon Musk talking to the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in an AI conference, answering rather softball questions. Now we have these kind of posts. Why do you think he's doing it right now?
Well, what Elon Musk is doing fits entirely within his ideology. Elon Musk is kind of right-wing, becoming increasingly right-wing, and is engaged in this what he sees as an anti-woke, anti-progressive values war. You know, he constantly retweets and promotes accounts spreading disinformation and hate speech towards minorities and members of, you know, the trans community. So I think what Musk is doing in promoting these far-right narratives and hashtags in the recent riots shouldn't be surprising. In fact, I would argue this is probably why Elon Musk took over Twitter. He didn't buy Twitter because it was a good financial decision. He himself acknowledges that. He bought Twitter because it was a platform for him to spread his ideology. And if he is the most followed person on X. And I think that's really important to remember. And he knows that. And he knows that a reply from him, a retweet from him, will actually boost something algorithmically, making a lot of people see that information who wouldn't ordinarily see it.
Well, he's not here to defend himself. He would say that he is an advocate for free speech. But I do wonder, what has he got to gain from this? Is it that loads of people are posting on it? This has been trending for so many days now. And actually, does this have more to do with the US election than it does with what's going on here?
I think it's both. I think he's obviously thrown his hat in with the right wing in the US. What he's doing is also promoting a level of far-right politics that is not limited to the UK or the US. This is a global movement that is increasingly anti-immigration, anti-minority, and particularly anti-Muslim. And I think this is really important to bear in mind, that he's whipping up this frenzy of anti-immigrant sentiment ahead of an election that's going to be extremely contested. So I think it's part of his playbook. And as I said, whilst you said he's not here to defend himself, and I acknowledge that, I don't think he is an advocate for free speech. There's been plenty of examples where he himself has censored certain people because he doesn't like what they're saying. So I think this fits in with his culture wars mentality. And, you know, it's only a few months now before we have the US presidential race. And I think he really is trying to mobilize support for a social media wave of animosity towards progressive Democrats and those who might vote left wing.
It's not just him who the government have accused of kind of inciting racial hatred. You've got Tommy Robinson, who's possibly sunning himself on a sunbed in Cyprus. He used to be banned on platforms like this. Should he and others like him be banned again?
I mean, I think they should. I think social media companies have a duty of care to the users. That duty of care involves not allowing the platform to be weaponized for hate speech and propaganda. And I think people are engaged in hate speech or propaganda or types of dangerous speech that undermine democracy and the safety of others, then they have no right to be on those platforms. And you have to remember that Elon Musk not only allowed Tommy Robinson back on the platform, he also allowed people like Donald Trump back on the platform. So, you know, I think he is deliberately being provocative with this notion of safety. And if we also remember that when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he deliberately disbanded the trust and safety team, which was the team designed to actually, try and prevent hate speech, try and prevent the proliferation of disinformation. So Musk's takeover was a slap in the face for those who want to use social media in a way that's conducive to like...
Sorry to cut across you. I just wanted to get one more final question in, which is that we've seen the first criminal prosecution of someone online for allegedly posting criminal messages linked to violence today in Leeds. Are tech bosses going to be worried about what they are allowing to publish and a possible crackdown that could come?
Yeah, they're definitely going to be worried. I mean, the UK has the online safety bill now, which basically penalizes false information being spread to cause non-trivial harm. If everyone was prosecuted for doing that, there'd be a lot of prosecutions. Tech companies know that these kind of laws hurt their bottom line, which is why they often lobby in places like Brussels to get certain laws not passed because they would be harmful. So they will definitely be worried now. And I think Elon Musk in particular would be worried, as he is I call the disinfluencer in chief, the disinformation influencer extraordinaire, who basically has made a living, or is making a living now, spreading false information.
OK, Mark Owen Jones, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Perhaps one of the most chilling images from the past few days is the sight of Muslim graves being vandalised in Burnley, an act the councillor leader described as evil. Our reporter Andrew Misra has been speaking to the brothers of one of those whose grave was targeted, now fearful for their family's safety.
Resting places disturbed and desecrated. Paint poured over several headstones in the Muslim burial area of Burnley Cemetery. Jakir Islam's grave was one of them. Although cleaned up now with the help of the community, Jakir's family, who come here every day, have been left disgusted by this targeted act of vandalism.
Watching the video brought tears to me, because thinking that, you know, we've only just buried our brother 17 months ago. We're still grieving as a family, mourning his death. This is like a new level of law to us. We've never seen this, where graveyards have been damaged, you know, vandalised, covered with paint all over. Some of the headstones, you couldn't even read out who he belonged to.
Why do you think anybody would do something like this?
You know, the Southport incident has affected all of us. I'm a father of 2 kids myself, and seeing children dying, it's really concerning, and it's distressing to see images of that sort. You know, I believe that the use of language here is very important as well. You know, blaming and calling it out, you know, blaming it on the Muslims is like an easy shout, just to, oh yeah, we would just put the blame on these Muslims now. But that causes a backlash, and we can see the backlash that's caused in this country.
Sueb has lived in Burnley all his life and says he's never experienced racism here. The town has come a long way since the racial tensions that sparked riots in 2001.
We have strong relationships in Burnley, and it's taken a long time to build that respect and for one another. And what that tells us, and the message we want to send out, is that Burnley's better than this, and the acts of one individual or a small group of individuals, as evil and as vile as they are in terms of what they've done here, we will not let that divide us as a community.
The damage to the graves is being treated as a hate crime by Lancashire Police. The force has increased its presence in the area to reassure the Muslim community. Many now fear for their safety.
Every day, me and my Muslim friends, obviously, we have a goal. No matter what, we're going to go to the mosque 5 times a day to pray. That's the bare minimum. Like, no matter what happens, we're going to go to pray. But now, some of my friends are like, say if we go out now, what's going to happen to us? Is everything going to be okay? Say we go now, who's going to look after my parents? Who's going to look after my sisters, my nieces at home?
And you've got children. You must now be worried about them as well.
I am, yes. You know, my daughter today, she was literally crying, saying, why are we not going to the ice cream parlour in Chester? You know, how can I explain that to a 5-year-old? To be honest, no one feels safe now, especially our women, children, ladies at home, mothers, wives, sisters, you know, way more concerned for them.
Sueb hopes speaking about what's happened can help rebuild understanding in the community.
We're the same as you guys. We just want to have a laugh, socialise. You know, we go to the mosque, pray. We want to safely do those daily routine, but our daily routine's been affected now. Like, you know, we all go to the mosque 5 times a day to pray. Most of us would reconsider that, whether, should we pray at home now or should we go to the mosque? You know, no one should feel like this, especially in your own community. We shouldn't be made to feel, you know, this way.
Jakir died in a car accident just last year. His family are still coming to terms with his loss. They never imagined anybody would try to tarnish his memory by targeting this sacred space for remembrance and reflection.
Andrew Misra reporting. There's one bit of good news. Just over a week on from the horrific Southport stabbings in which 3 children died, triggering the unrest, Liverpool's Alder Hey Hospital has confirmed all the children it has been treating for injuries have now been discharged and are back home with their families. Over to Matt now in London.
Thanks, Aisha. Well, a week's worth of rioting and more than 400 arrests so far will only ramp up pressure on the nation's crumbling prison service. The government has pledged hundreds of extra places to deal with the fallout, but unions are warning that a wave of new inmates could cripple already struggling jails. Case in point, HMP Wandsworth, today blasted by the prison's watchdog over shocking and catastrophic conditions stemming from failures of leadership at every level. Here's Emily Wither.
It's so bad. It's just not fit for human consumption in that place. Like, animals live better than that.
Sophie, not her real name, worries every day about her son inside Wandsworth Prison. The dilapidated Victorian building is notorious for drugs, violence. Last September, a terror suspect allegedly escaped, sparking a national manhunt. And just last week, a prison officer pleaded guilty after having sex with an inmate in a cell. But behind the headlines, Sophie says even her son's basic needs are not being met.
They was doing electrics outside on the wing. So they switched all their electric off. He couldn't have no fan on, no running water. And that was for 24 hours.
He wasn't allowed out for 24 hours?
No, not at all. Just locked up for 24 hours with no water or no electric, and it was the hottest day of the year.
Released today, the results of an inspection into Wandsworth Prison in May, described as catastrophic. The prison was deemed fundamentally unsafe, with 7 men taking their own lives in just a year. Rates of self-harm were high and rising, but 40% of emergency cell bells were not answered within 5 minutes. Overall rates of violence had increased, and tests showed 44% of inmates were actively using drugs. Conditions were described as appalling, and 80% of men were sharing cells designed for one person. The Ministry of Justice says over the next 5 years they'll be redirecting £100 million from across the prison service to this one to make urgent improvements. But this severely overcrowded prison is being described as symbolic of the problems facing the wider system at a time when space is running low and the need for extra cells is set to rise. After a week of riots around the country, the Justice Minister says for every person involved in violence, there'll be a prison place waiting for them, with more than 500 spaces opening in the next month to help house rioters. But prison governors fear it'll be touch and go as to whether a creaking system will cope.
Our organisation, the Prison Service, is in crisis. What we're seeing is the system is grinding to a halt, and some of the issues at Wandsworth are indicative to what's happening across the estate.
And it will be already overstretched prison staff who will eventually be charged with looking after the people rioting over the last week, at a time when we've found experienced officers are in decline. Prison officer numbers fell by a quarter in the first half of the 2010s. That's according to analysis by our fact-check team. Numbers started to recover at the end of the decade, but there are still fewer officers now than in 2010. And when we look at officers with at least 5 years' experience, the picture is even worse. There's been a small uptick in recent years, but the number of seasoned prison staff is still 40% lower than it was in 2010, even though the total number of prisoners is higher now than it was that year.
Every cell in Wandsworth looks as if somebody's broken it up.
Chaplain Liz Bridge has seen firsthand how overcrowded, dangerous prisons lead to a breakdown in mental health. She's volunteered at Wandsworth for over a decade. She's now made it her personal mission to attend every inquest into a death at the prison, so more lives aren't lost while in the care of the state.
When you die in the prison, very often the men haven't got any family. They're lost. And nobody stands up and says, what sort of care did this person have? Why have they been allowed to get to this point? And I think that's important, because it's appalling in Wandsworth, but it's all over our prison system. Just Wandsworth manages to get to the top of the pack for awfulness.
Emily Wither reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, and started by asking whether an already stretched prison system can cope with an influx of convicted rioters.
Certainly it puts additional pressure on the system. The bath, as we know, was already in danger of overflowing. And if there's a big influx of new prisoners coming in, then of course that immediately puts it under even more strain. So look, the government's got the early release scheme running at the moment. There's a new early release scheme which will come in September when prisoners, the remission period will be reduced to 40% rather than 50%. But we'll see how this plays out in time. Certainly we don't want to be in a situation that we have been in the past where we're having to use police cells for extended periods of time. Certainly that's not helpful at all. So we'll see how this plays out.
The government has said that the system is ready to absorb people. Do they even know about the conditions inside these prisons to say that?
Well, I'd like to think that people are reading our reports, and certainly what we highlight in our report in Wandsworth is enormous levels of overcrowding. Wandsworth was originally built for about 1,100. There were 1,500 or so prisoners there when we inspected, and there have been up to 1,600 prisoners there. It's completely overcrowded. It's on a very small footprint. There isn't enough space for any sort of purposeful activity to really go ahead in the place. And prisoners are locked in their cells for 22 hours a day.
Prisoners locked in their cells for 22 hours a day, and then you might get some new prisoners who are, far-right extremists. Again, that's a recipe for potential disaster as well, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a lot of very complicated people in prisons, and certainly anything that adds to the combustibility of prisons is always a risk.
But are you worried about far-right grooming in prisons?
Well, I think there's always the potential for this to happen. I mean, prisons tend to be not places like Wandsworth, but the more sophisticated prisons where people are spending longer sentences, they tend to be quite tuned in to be able to pick up some of that sort of activity. But certainly in places like Wandsworth, which are at the best of times flying by the seat of its pants with such a churn of prisoners going through it every week, it's difficult to monitor everything that's going on.
So we found out in our research that since 2010, the decline in experienced prison officers is about 40%. You just haven't got the right people to run the places.
Yeah, and Wandsworth is a case in point. A lot of incredibly inexperienced staff. Some of them are brilliant. Some of them will go on to be great prison officers. But if you've got very inexperienced people being led by almost equally inexperienced people, which is exactly what we found in Wandsworth, then no one really knows what they're doing. And prisoners, staff didn't know when anyone was going to get unlocked. They weren't even able to count prisoners properly.
You've been the Inspector of Prison since 2020, is that right?
Indeed.
The situation that you describe yourself is catastrophic. How did it get so bad?
Part of this is since COVID, prisons haven't begun to unlock prisoners at anything like the rate that we would want to see. So too many prisoners are languishing, locked in their cells for long periods of time with not enough to do, and the quality of the offer when it comes to purposeful activity isn't good enough. What do bored prisoners do? Well, the temptation is to go away and take drugs, and that's what we're seeing in lots of jails.
As a country, should we be ashamed of the state of our prisons?
Well, they're not good enough. It's very simple. They're simply not good enough. As I say, there are some great beacons of some really good practice, but there are lots of prisons which just aren't doing as well as they need to be. And the worry, whether it's about shame or not, my worry is that people are coming out from prison and they're reduced, their risk of reoffending has not been reduced. And that, to me, is unacceptable.
And finally, if you had to point to one thing that has led to this catastrophic decline, what is it?
Well, I'd probably say drugs overall. I think prison service is up against serious organised crime, discovering more and more sophisticated ways of getting drugs into prison. There are enormous markups on drugs. There are people who are already addicted to drugs, and there are people who are bored out of their mind who are getting pulled into drugs. So the influx of drugs into prison and the lack of any purposeful activity, so people feel they're wasting their time, they're not making any progress, and they're not reducing their risk of reoffending when they come out.
Charlie Taylor, thanks very much.
My pleasure.